November 18, 1942, Guadalcanal Canal. At Rabaul Air Base, a Japanese officer scribbled in his diary, "These American twin-engine fighters, they seem slow, they shouldn't be a problem." He was referring to the P-38 Lightning, an aircraft that, according to Japanese intelligence, posed no real threat to the fast and agile Zero fighters. For them, air dominance was still guaranteed by the spiritual and technical superiority of their pilots. It was just a matter of honor, maneuverability, and courage. This belief, cultivated from China to Pearl Harbor, was about to be shattered. What the Japanese saw as an aluminum freak with two tails and two low-rumbling engines was actually the practical manifestation of something they were not prepared to face, a modern air doctrine, forged by numbers, industrial power, and engineering applied to total war. This video will tell the story of the exact moment when Japan discovered that it was not enough to have spirit. The P-38 Lightning didn't just climb faster, it subverted the entire logic of aerial combat. And when the Japanese pilots tried to escape, it was too late. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story with surgical precision. In the first major encounter between the P-38 Lightning and Japanese fighters over Guadalcanal, 15 enemy aircraft were shot down. Only one P-38 was lost. For the first time, the legendary Zero, until then Lord of the Skies, was defeated not by numbers, but by altitude, power, and applied science. From that moment on, the fights no longer began with curves. They began with lightning from above. If you value this type of story, based on facts, comparisons, and detailed analysis, like, share, and subscribe. This helps us to continue revealing the battles that were not won on the field of honor, but on the drawing board of the factories and in the hands of engineers who changed the course of the war. To understand the shock of the Japanese pilots in front of the P-38 Lightning, one must first understand the pedestal on which the Zero fighter had been placed, not only by the enemies, but by Japan itself. By 1941, the Mitsubishi A6M-0 was already seen as an extension of the samurai spirit in the skies of the Pacific. With a smaller turning radius than any rival and an operational range of nearly 2,000 miles, the Zero wasn't just a fighter, it was a national symbol. Light, fast, lethal, and built on a simple and dangerous principle: sacrifice protection for maneuverability. Shield, unnecessary weight, self-sealing tanks, a luxury that would only hinder performance. The doctrine was clear. The pilot would win with skill, not armor. It was a vision of war that exalted man above the machine, courage above statistics. And for a while, it worked. Between 1937 and 1942, Japan racked up successive victories against obsolete aircraft. Brewster Buffaloes were falling into flames in Malaya. Wildcats disappeared in the Pacific. Curtiss P-40s were beaten at sharp corners over China. Each combat reinforced the illusion of invincibility, and Japanese confidence was transformed into doctrine. The problem? The enemy was no longer measuring the war in courage, but in industrial capacity. While Japan improved Zero by tactical refinement, the United States worked with production scales and technological leaps. The American engineers, led by Clarence Kelly Johnson, did not seek to win duels. They planned to win systems, and it was exactly this mentality that created the P-38 Lightning. Instead of designing a fighter to behave like an aerial swordsman, the Americans created a combat platform that was versatile, fast, tough, and lethal in all respects, ignored by the Japanese. Turbochargers for altitude performance, armor for the pilot, self-sealing tanks, and autonomy to cross oceans. While Japanese pilots practiced turning at low speed, Americans taught math, physics, and long-range navigation. The Japanese memorized maneuvers. The Americans studied vectors. The first critical mistake of the Japanese was to believe that they were facing the same enemy as in 1941. In an internal memorandum dated July 1942, a Japanese commander in Rabaul described the new American twin-engine fighters as too big to turn and concluded, "They will be easy targets for our aces." In effect, they were witnessing the birth of a new class of fighter, and they didn't realize it until it was too late. The Zero was designed for a short, quick, and localized war. The P-38 was made for a long, intercontinental, unpredictable war. In technical terms, it was like putting a bamboo blade against a steel bridge. In practical terms, it was like trying to beat the industry with spirituality. But perhaps the most ignored data is this. While Japan took almost 3 years to produce 10,000 units of the Zero, the United States, with Lockheed's apparatus, produced the same number of P-38s in half the time, with 18 different variants, each correcting previous weaknesses. That's the difference between a fighter and an evolution line. And for those who found this surprising, write in the comments, "Logistics wins," because that was what was at stake. War would not be decided by courage, but by adaptation. Zero's decline did not begin with a battle. It started with a misconception, that maneuverability beats all. The Americans, after the initial losses, changed the doctrine. They learned not to get into corner fights. They developed vertical tactics. They flew in pairs. They used altitude as a trench. They applied engineering to lethality. And with lightning, the sky is no longer a stage for honor, but a domain of calculation. The greatest irony is that for the Japanese, the Zero was invincible, because until then it faced less prepared planes. But the P-38 wasn't just a new plane, it was the first enemy designed to defeat the very concept of invincibility. And that brings us to the breaking point. When the first Japanese pilot reported that the P-38 climbed faster than the Zero, no one believed it. When they realized that he could climb from sea level and reach 30,000 feet before the Zeros completed the half ascent, panic began. And it wasn't just vertical speed. It was the reach, robustness, the shielding, the silence of turbocharged engines, the weapon concentrated in the nose. It was a list of details ignored by Japanese doctrine, but which together formed an equation that not even the most experienced of aces could solve. The next installment will reveal the exact moment when this equation materialized in the skies over Guadalcanal, and when Japanese pilots discovered that this time the war had come from the top down. In the months leading up to the direct confrontation, Japanese intelligence reports began to record something curious, the presence of a new American aircraft operating from bases in the South Pacific. It was described as a heavy fighter, with 2 long parallel tails, twin engines, and a disproportionate central fuselage. The first reaction of the veteran drivers was laughter. In makeshift instruction rooms in Rabaul or Leh, instructors looked at photographs and shook their heads. They said that it could never be equal to Zero. Too heavy to climb, too big to maneuver. Some suggested that it was a reconnaissance aircraft, others of an experimental light bomber. The appearance did not match any known archetype. The Zero, with its sleek aerodynamics and tapered profile, represented the beauty of lethality, a fusion of form and function. The P-38, by contrast, looked like an asymmetrical monster, something out of an engineering error. No one took it seriously, and it was exactly this contempt that sealed the tragedy. Japanese air doctrine did not even have the language to describe a twin-engine air superiority fighter. In Japan's tactical mindset, single-engine fighters would win the day. The speed at low altitude, the sharp turn, and the aggressive initiative were the pillars. Armor was useless weight. Concentrated weaponry was unnecessary. After all, the duel was won at less than 200 meters, turn by turn. Against this reasoning, the P-38 presented itself as an enigma. He not only defied technical parameters, but subverted the philosophical premises of imperial aviation. While the Zero was thought of as an extension of the warrior, The P-38 was the extension of the industry. Americans did not seek elegance. They were looking for performance, and the appearance of the machine said little about its real purpose: to control the sky from above, to dictate the terms of engagement, to attack before the enemy noticed. What the Japanese would laugh at today would be the terror of the following mornings. In practice, the P-38 didn't need to rotate better than the Zero. It needed to avoid rotating with it. And that's what the Americans trained: vertical tactics, dive and escape, quick attacks from above, always maintaining superior energy. What seemed like cowardice from the Japanese perspective was, in fact, effective doctrine based on applied physics. The Zero's extreme maneuverability became irrelevant when the fight did not take place horizontally. And this difference in approach was incomprehensible to many Japanese officers. A fighter that avoided dogfighting was not considered worthy. The problem is that he was not hit either. The visual structure of the P-38 was also a source of derision. That split fuselage, with the cockpit centered and the engines far away, seemed like an unfinished project. But there was logic there. Tail separation increased stability at high speed. The distant engines protected the pilot in the event of a failure or fire, and the nose-focused weaponry, a combination of 450 machine guns and a 20mm cannon, allowed all shots to be direct, without the need for wing-to-wing convergence. This meant that a single second of accurate shot at 400 km/h was lethal. The Japanese, still operating with asymmetrical wing-mounted weaponry and limited ammunition, quickly discovered that the difference was not just in design. It was lethality. A Japanese report intercepted months later revealed the technical bewilderment. The P-38 fighter has unusual behavior. It rises more than it should. It does not slow down as predicted. It shoots from afar with deadly accuracy. In other words, everything that Japanese doctrine ignored now came back as a sentence. Tactical bias had a price, and it would be paid in the skies of the Pacific. The underestimation was not limited to pilots. The Japanese command believed that the United States would never create a functional twin-engine fighter. It was the idea that complexity brought weakness. But while Japan was still hand-repairing its Zeros in makeshift hangars, the Americans were standardizing parts, mechanizing assembly lines, and upgrading variants in 6-month cycles. The P-38, when it finally faced the Zero, was no longer the same as in the reconnaissance photos. It was faster, more stable, and better armed. And yet, the Japanese insisted on the idea that it was just big and slow. The historical irony is brutal. The effectiveness of a war machine was judged on the basis of aesthetics, and he paid for it with lives. In the first weeks of engagements, the Lightning was responsible for accurate kills at altitudes where the Zeros couldn't even operate safely. The image of a strange fighter emerging from above and diving with concentrated fire became recurrent in the accounts of the few survivors. And from that moment on, the laughter of the veterans gave way to a question that still echoed on the field radios: how to stop this? The answer would come too late, because while the Japanese were still trying to figure out what they were up against, the Americans were ready to escalate the war, both in numbers and scope. In the next part, the P-38 finally enters real combat, and the skies over Guadalcanal witness the first technical turning point of the entire air war in the Pacific. The birth of the P-38 Lightning was not an accident, nor was it the result of creative intuition. It was pure engineering, an objective answer to a desperate question: how do you build a fighter that could take off from the United States, fly 400 miles, intercept bombers at 20,000 feet, and return without refueling? This USAAC specification, issued in February 1937, seemed absurd to most designers at the time. But on Clarence Kelly Johnson's drawing board at Lockheed, it has become a technical challenge, not an impossibility. In less than 2 years, the concept was in the air. The result was a machine like no other. Two Allison V1710 engines, each with General Electric turbochargers to maintain high-altitude performance. A separate central fuselage, intended exclusively for the pilot and armament. External tanks for transcontinental flights. And a tricycle landing gear, modern, stable, and adapted for improvised runways. The P-38 was the first American fighter to exceed 650 km/h in level flight. But the most impressive thing was not the speed. It was the operational altitude of more than 12,000 meters, where most enemy fighters did not work properly. Up there, the air was thin and the resistance was minimal. Up there, the P-38 decided the moment of combat. The armament, concentrated in the nose, included 4 Browning, 50 machine guns, and a 20mm Hispano cannon, all firing in a straight line, without convergence. While fighters like the Zero required the pilot to calculate the rendezvous point of bullets fired from opposite wings, the P-38 delivered lethal accuracy at any distance. 1 second of direct fire was enough to disintegrate an enemy's fuselage. It was an engineering advantage applied to combat, less subjective, more mathematical. The structure of the plane also reflected this logic. Packed with redundancies, the Lightning could fly with 1 motor, withstand heavy impacts, and remain operational even after serious damage. It was the opposite of the purposeful fragility of the Zero, which sacrificed any armor to gain lightness. Japan relied on the ability of its pilots to avoid being hit. The Americans accepted that they would be hit and designed their aircraft to survive. This philosophical difference exposed 2 ways of thinking about war. Japan saw combat as an art, a duel of honor where each pilot was a unique piece. The United States viewed the war as a logistical equation, and it was in this equation that the P-38 was born. Its project provided for field maintenance with minimal tooling, quick part change, and scalability in production. Each bolt was part of a modular logic. Each system was made to work together. The Lightning wasn't a masterpiece. It was an industrial product of war. And that was precisely what made him dangerous. During altitude testing, the P-38 revealed one of its greatest invisible weapons, the ability to operate above most radars and enemy interception range. In 1942, still in advanced testing, a prototype crossed the United States from coast to coast in just over 7 hours, an unthinkable feat for a fighter at the time. The news reached Japan in a piecemeal form and was immediately dismissed as propaganda. No one in the Imperial General Staff believed that a twin-engine fighter could be effective in real combat, but the irony was about to be fulfilled. While the Japanese scoffed at the speed with which the Americans changed designs, the Americans produced new fighters faster than the enemies could respond. P-38 production was incorporated into a logistics ecosystem that was already in motion. Integrated factories, a national supply chain, synchronized rail transportation all contributed to Lockheed delivering hundreds of aircraft a month. By 1943, the Burbank plant alone had delivered 5,000 units. And while Japan assembled fighters by hand in hangars vulnerable to bombing, the Americans standardized components, trained mechanics, and maintained operating rates of 80% or higher, even in extreme climates. The P-38 was difficult to fly, yes. It required technique, attention, and control at high speeds, but he delivered what he promised: height, reach, and destruction. And these 3 factors were about to change the whole logic of the air war in the Pacific. One final detail defines its identity as a strategic weapon. The P-38 was the only American fighter in operation capable of escorting bombers at long range at the beginning of the war. While other fighters were limited to flying in local defense, the Lightning could cross oceans. This allowed reconnaissance, interception, and even tactical assassination missions to be planned based on their autonomy. Japanese intelligence realized this too late. When the first reports of fighters appearing 600 kilometers from the base began to circulate, many analysts thought it was a navigational error, but it wasn't. It was the beginning of a new era, where the sky ceased to be shared territory and became the exclusive domain of those who could reach it first, from above, with more power and less risk. The story, however, does not end at the drawing board. Every weapon needs to prove its worth in real combat, and Lightning was about to have his baptism of fire. In the next chapter, we'll look at the moment when the P-38 took to the skies over the Pacific for its first operational mission, and when Japanese fighters discovered they were no longer alone on top. November 18th, 1942. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The sun had not yet completely broken through the horizon when the P-38 engines began to roar in sync. It was the first real operational mission of the 339th Fighter Squadron using the new Lightnings. The goal, to patrol an area north of the Solomon Islands and intercept any Japanese air movements. Until then, the Zeros reigned in that sky. Allied pilots knew they would not get a second chance if they underestimated the enemy. But something changed that morning. The takeoff was clean, fast, the ascent vertical and constant. The silence of the turbochargers created a sound illusion. The P-38s moved with speed, but without the acoustic signature that betrayed most fighters. At 08:47 a.m., observers recorded eye contact. 3 Zeros, flying in low formation, were heading towards Guadalcanal. They didn't know it, but heaven was no longer theirs. The attack was fulminant. From an altitude of more than 7,000 meters, the Lightnings dived with precision. The speed exceeded 700 km/h. None of the Japanese riders were able to react in time. The 50 machine guns opened fire with a concentrated pattern in a straight line, with no need for convergence correction. The first Zero disintegrated while still diving. The second tried an evasive turn, but lost lift. The third was shot down as it attempted to climb, only to find that the P-38 climbed higher. It was the first time the Japanese had seen altitude become a disadvantage, and it was the first time that the Americans dictated the engagement. No Lightning was hit. No American pilot was even shot. The mission ended with 3 enemy aircraft destroyed and an unprecedented feeling on Imperial Air Force radios. Confusion. The reports described attacks from above, heavy fighters, and unknown movements. A Japanese pilot who managed to escape reported that the enemy's speed was greater than ours uphill, and his presence was felt only when it was too late. Japanese doctrine, built on the idea of dominance in sharp turns and individual tactical superiority, collapsed in the face of a new reality. Combat had moved to another dimension, vertical, technical, invisible. The P-38s did not fight as expected. They didn't rotate, they did not duel. They gave no room for the display of bravery. They attacked, killed, and disappeared. This was the new logic of air warfare. Brutal efficiency. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The Zero's flaws, low armor, lack of power at altitude, vulnerable tanks, were known internally, but the doctrine ignored them. Faith in the spiritual superiority of the pilots blinded the command. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts ignored or suppressed by traditional storytelling, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content like this. Henderson Field's mission was more than a tactical success. It represented the birth of a new phase in the Pacific Air War. From then on, the P-38 would be used with increasing aggressiveness. It would cease to be just a technological novelty to become the axis of the Allied offensive in the skies. And while the Japanese were trying to understand what had happened, the Americans were already preparing the next step, eliminating strategic targets with surgical precision. Because now that they dominated the heavens, they would begin to choose who should live and who would fall before they even saw the enemy. Air supremacy is not only measured in kills, but in the ability to choose when and where to fight. After the first successful P-38 engagements over Guadalcanal, a new dynamic emerged in the Pacific theater. Combat ceased to be horizontal. Japanese doctrine, shaped around maneuverability at low altitudes, was stuck on a battlefield that no longer existed. While the Zero relied on tight turns, coordinated turns, and visual combat, the P-38 operated above the clouds, in rarefied territory, where noise disappeared and physics replaced instinct. It was the era of vertical warfare. The Lightning climbed with constant power, thanks to the turbochargers. At altitudes above 8,000 meters, it maintained control, power, and speed, three factors that Zero simply could not sustain. Japanese engines, without supercharging, lost performance quickly. The controls became unstable, visibility was compromised, and in this new scenario, the decision to combat came exclusively from the American side. American pilots, instructed in modern tactics, began to adopt the so-called boom and zoom. High-speed vertical dives, concentrated firing, and immediate resumption of altitude. There was no prolonged engagement. There was no duel. There was calculation. The P-38 would enter the theater, make its choice, and disappear before the enemies could react. With weapons in his nose, he did not need to align wings or rotate his body. It was enough to point it out. The kinetic energy of the dive, combined with the reduced density of the air, turned each attack into a blast that was almost impossible to avoid. The Japanese, stuck in the logic of curve and countercurve, tried to react, but they fought against gravity and against their own mechanical limits. The new trench was invisible. It was between 25 and 35,000 feet. Up there, Japanese radars had limited range. The radios were starting to fail, and the pilots, unaccustomed to flying in upper layers of the troposphere, made errors in navigation and fuel calculation. Japanese training, focused on individual dexterity, did not prepare its men for tactical maneuvers in 3 dimensions. The Americans, on the other hand, trained in squadrons with detailed flight plans and higher technical training, operated as coordinated units. The sky was no longer a contest between lone hunters. It was an aerial architecture, and the Lightning occupied the top. This vertical superiority also had a psychological impact. With each new attack from above, Japanese morale dropped. The feeling of helplessness spread. It wasn't just a matter of losses, it was the certainty that the enemy saw earlier, flew higher, and shot more accurately. Many drivers began to report the feeling of being constantly watched. That the combat could start at any moment, and almost always started from above. The Japanese doctrine of surveillance and initiative had been reversed, and with it, the mastery of the air. The technical irony of vertical warfare was in the numbers. While the Zero maintained a rate of climb of about 3,000 feet per minute under ideal conditions, the P-38 topped 4,000, even with full armament and auxiliary tanks. In combat, this translated into seconds of advantage, but seconds in the sky decide lives. What's more, while the Zero pilots had to choose between performance and range, the Americans flew both. The P-38's external tanks could be dropped in seconds, allowing the fighter to switch between long-range missions and quick engagements without having to return to base. Tactical flexibility, industrial precision, physics had become a weapon, altitude, shield, and the heavens, until then domains of instinct, were now calculated by angles, vectors, and accumulated energy. This was the new war. A war where maneuvering well was less important than seeing first. Where he turned fast, he lost to climb higher. And where combat doctrine, once centered on honor and dueling, was now guided by statistics and efficiency. Japanese pilots weren't just losing fighters. They were losing their grip on the very concept of combat. The next part of this story leads us to a surgical operation. A planned attack with military mathematics, where the P-38 would prove that it was not just a combat weapon, it was a strategic platform. And his next target would not be just any plane, but the very brain of the Imperial Japanese Navy, April 18, 1943. On an advanced runway on Guadalcanal Island, 16 P-38 Lightning were waiting for takeoff authorization. It was just before 7 a.m. None of the pilots carried any personal symbols on the aircraft. There were no words of encouragement painted on the fuselages. Just silence, just coordinates. The target was singular. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor and Supreme Commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy. American intelligence had intercepted and deciphered his communications, discovering that he would be making an inspection tour of the Solomon Islands, flying from Rabaul to Bougainville in a G4M Betty, a light bomber converted for transport. The Japanese flight plan was accurate, and the American even more. The challenge was monumental: to reach the exact point of the enemy's path at the exact minute after flying almost 700 kilometers over the open ocean, the largest interception mission in history up to that point. To avoid radar detection, the P-38s would fly within 15 meters of the sea surface for more than 2 hours, maintaining tight formation, maximum fuel economy, and purely manual navigation. There was no GPS. There were no satellites. Just compasses, speed calculations, and the operational coolness of a squad trained to act like a synchronized machine. The plan was so bold that many commanders doubted its execution, but the American command trusted the Lightning. No other fighter in operation could fly so far, maintain high cruising speed, carry full armament, and still face enemy escort at the end of the mission. It was the materialization of the doctrine that had been built: attack with mathematical precision, execute with technological superiority, and disappear before the enemy could understand. At 09:34 a.m., American radars identified the target. 3 aircraft appeared north of Bougainville: the Yamamoto transport bomber, a second G4M, and 6 Zero fighters as escorts. The P-38s, already positioned at altitude, did what they had been trained to do. The strike group dove over the Admiral's plane. The rest of the fighters engaged with the escort. There was no hesitation. There was no mistake. Within minutes, Yamamoto's plane was hit, caught fire, and spiraled over the Bougainville forest. The second G4M tried to flee, but was shot down soon after. 2 Zeros were destroyed. Only 1 P-38 was lost, not by enemy fire, but by return damage. All the others returned safely. The impact of the attack was immediate and devastating. News of Yamamoto's death was kept secret for weeks. For Japan, it wasn't just the loss of a commander. It was the implicit recognition that the United States could see, plan, and execute a kill with absolute accuracy. The myth of Japanese strategic invisibility had fallen. For the first time, the Imperial Command had to admit that its communication had been intercepted, its plans anticipated, and its leadership vulnerable. What's more, the mission revealed something even more terrifying than the lethality of the P-38. It revealed the American ability to integrate intelligence, technology, navigation, and air force into a single coordinated gesture of war. It was the birth of precision warfare. The attack also had an irreversible symbolic effect. Yamamoto was more than a commander. He was a national figure. His death, calculated with a margin of error of seconds, revealed to the world that the United States was no longer just reacting, it was hunting, and they were winning with numbers, data, and engineering. Not coincidentally, German officials in Berlin analyzed the attack with concern. If the Americans could do it in the Pacific, what could they do in Europe, with even greater range and denser intelligence? In the next part, we'll look at just that. How the engineering that created the P-38 was just the first step in an industrial air empire that was beginning to take shape, and that would soon spread across the skies of every continent. Because Lightning had opened its doors. But what would come next? It was even more lethal. In the months following the attack on Yamamoto, A subtle but profound change began to creep into the operational reports of the Imperial Japanese Air Force. Once confident, often even poetic in their descriptions of combat, the documents now exhibited a new hue: caution, distrust, fear. The P-38 Lightning, once derided as a tank with wings, had become the ghost of the sky. In escort or patrol missions, its appearance was described with an expression that was repeated in several reports: Kuchu no Yurei, the aerial ghost. It wasn't just his speed or firepower, it was the fact that he always seemed to arrive from above, and when it didn't give any leeway. In a letter rescued from a surviving pilot, dated August 1943, the sentence was clear: "When white fighters fall from the sky like lightning, we hear nothing. We just feel the impact." For the first time, Japanese fighters, once predators, now fell prey. This moral reversal intensified when new squadrons of P-38s were deployed to operate closer to Rabaul, Leh, and other strategic bases. American doctrine was now aggressive and mathematical: intercept, destroy, disappear. Japanese doctrine still insisted on tactical initiative, but pilots already knew that, against the Lightning, every attempt at engagement was a lottery. What was once considered cowardice, avoiding combat, now began to be filed as prudence. An internal report sent to the High Command in September 1943 explicitly recommended that smaller patrols avoid any confrontation with American twin-engine aircraft. The term used was sento no teishi, suspension of combat. In other words, run away if you can. And that, for a code of honor based on aggressiveness, was the beginning of doctrinal surrender. The psychological pressure was compounded by the growing realization that Americans knew better. They knew where, when, and how to attack. The fighters appeared at precise times, on unlikely routes, with logistical support that defied Japanese logic. And indeed, the data showed the root of this ubiquity. While Japan operated with an artisanal and vulnerable production structure, the United States was delivering fighters on an industrial scale. Between 1941 and 1944, Lockheed produced more than 10,000 P-38s. In contrast, Japan, in the same period, produced about 10,000 Zeros, but with much more difficulty, fewer spare parts, and no real capacity for modernization in the field. And here's the statistic that changed everything. While Japan struggled to keep some 2,500 aircraft operational across the Pacific theater, the US kept more than 12,000 aircraft ready and fueled in the region alone. That means that logistically, the Americans could lose 5 times as many planes and still maintain total superiority. If this comparison surprises you, leave a word in the comments that sums up this abyss. Absolute power, shocking data, or simply logistics wins. But it wasn't just a matter of quantity, it was constancy. The Japanese were stuck with a collapsing doctrine with no time to adapt, while the Americans upgraded engines, radar, armor, and ammunition in months-long cycles. What started as tactical advantage became an operational tsunami, and the Japanese pilots felt it firsthand. One veteran officer, in an interview decades later, reported, "We were trained to die fighting, but to fight with those fighters was to run to die without a chance." Samurai doctrine, centered on the honor of death in combat, was now forced to recognize that some combats were no longer honor, they were execution. As P-38s became ubiquitous, Japanese commanders faced a moral dilemma: send their men to die against fighters operating at an absolute advantage, or preserve units for more balanced combat. The decision, in many cases, was to avoid engagements. Reports show that patrols were aborted after detection of multiple contacts at higher altitude. The Japanese radar, backward and unreliable, did not help. And the result was predictable. The Imperial Air Force went from aggressor to fugitive in less than a year. This reversal also had an impact on recruits. Fear of the Lightning has contaminated the aviation academies. Specific instructions on how to identify and avoid the P-38 began to circulate. A 1944 Japanese tactical manual described the Lightning as unbeatable on the climb, lethal on a frontal attack, and almost always accompanied by others. The final warning was dry: avoid direct combat. Stepping back is not shame. And this was perhaps the greatest symbol of the collapse. When a doctrine based on absolute courage starts to recommend withdrawal, the spirit is already broken. But the most devastating was yet to come. Because while Japan wallowed in its own doctrinal limitations, American engineers were working on something even more ruthless. A turbocharged version of the Lightning doctrine itself, but in 4 engines, with transcontinental range and the ability to turn cities to ashes. The war had ceased to be aerial. It was about to become strategic. And the P-38, it was just the rehearsal. In 1943, the real gulf between Japan and the United States was not just in the skies, but in the classrooms, hangars, and training tracks. The American war machine had understood that it was not enough to produce superior fighters. It was necessary to feed these fighters with operators to match. The training of American pilots was methodical, progressive, and guided by a technical philosophy. A USAF pilot went through a structured journey, advanced theoretical instruction, hundreds of hours in simulators, practice with aircraft of multiple categories, and continuous adaptation to new equipment. On average, an American pilot arrived in combat with more than 400 hours of flight time, some exceeding 600. They understood instrumentation, radar reading, astronomical navigation, fuel consumption, formation strategies. They were not knights of the air. They were engineers with wings. At the other end of the Pacific, Japan saw its talent pools run out. The aces of 1941 were already dead or exhausted. Time, fuel, and ammunition were in short supply. New recruits went through, on average, only 120 to 150 hours of flight time before being thrown into combat. In many cases, they made their first solo flights already inside frontline fighters. The result was predictable: panic, disorientation, early death. The Japanese training doctrine, based on long mentorships and natural progression, collapsed under the industrial pressure of the war. Japan tried to train warriors in weeks, but received victims. The P-38 Lightning did not forgive these mistakes. In real confrontations, the difference between a trained pilot and an improvised one was seconds. Lightning required technical discipline, but it also rewarded logic. An American pilot knew that climbing gave him an energy advantage. He knew that the frontal attack concentrated fire. He knew when to dive and when to save fuel. The Japanese, on the other hand, were thrown into the air with vague orders and outdated doctrines. Many were instructed to maintain visual formation, even when targets appeared out of sight. The result was chronic disorganization. Squadrons broke at the first sign of contact. Pilots reacted by instinct, and instinct against a twin-engine fighter armed with radar and turbocharging was suicide. The American training structure also stood out for its ability to adapt. When a pattern of combat changed, a new maneuver, a new threat, schools updated their curricula within weeks. New manuals were distributed, and the simulators were reprogrammed. Japan did not have this agility. The scarcity of resources was accompanied by a doctrinal rigidity. Blind faith in personal sacrifice replaced technical analysis. The strategy was to resist, not reinvent oneself, and on an aerial battlefield where every degree of inclination, every second of delay could decide death, this was unacceptable. There was also the human factor. American pilots were encouraged to survive, coming back, accumulating experience. A veteran became an instructor, multiplied his knowledge. In Japan, the hero was the kamikaze before his time. Culture did not value the return, it valued sacrifice, and a war that rewards the death of the best, rather than preserving their brains, is doomed to regress. By 1944, this would become even more visible. The combat average of a newly graduated Japanese pilot was less than 5 missions before being shot down. In the US, pilots survived dozens of engagements, learned from them, and came back better. The war had ceased to be a contest of courage. It was now a test of human engineering. This disparity was even manifested in the logistics of the instruction. While Japan saved fuel, the US spent hundreds of gallons a day on training flights, simulated tactical maneuvers, and emergency practice. The Americans trained as they fought. The Japanese fought without having had time to train. By 1943, the US operated more than 1,200 training bases on the mainland. Japan, on the other hand, saw its training centers being moved inland, away from coastal areas, for fear of attacks. Training was rushed, fragmented, insecure. The result of this structural difference was visible not only in the tactics, but in the eyes of the pilots. An American veteran reported, "When you saw a Zero approaching, you just had to look at the pattern. If he made a mistake in the formation or made unnecessary turns, we knew he was a rookie. The mission ceased to be combat and became execution." Another, when reviewing the wreckage of downed fighter jets, observed that many had their weapons untouched, a sign that they were not even able to react before being hit. The cruel irony is that the Japanese still believed they were up against equal pilots. But they were up against operators trained in a system that began with ground simulators and ended with missions guided by precise navigation. Each American pilot was the product of an integrated system. Each Lightning was just the visible tip of a chain of human and technological production that stretched across factories, schools, commands, doctrines, and manuals. Japan tried to compensate for all of this with spirit, but spirit is no substitute for physics, nor the practice, nor the logistics. And the numbers sealed the verdict. By 1943, the United States was graduating more than 10,000 pilots a month. Japan, that same year, failed to train even 200. This statistic wasn't just a comparison, it was a sentence. Because while the Americans were making more planes, more pilots, and more fuel, Japan manufactured hope, and hope alone does not fly. In the next part, we'll look at how this same logic of preparedness, predictability, and range allowed the P-38 to take on a new strategic role, not just to win battles, but to pave the way for bombers that would change warfare, city by city. In the rarefied silence of the high altitudes of the Pacific, the war changed its sound. Japanese pilots, accustomed to the visceral roar of low-altitude engagements, engines screaming in tight maneuvers, and gusts cutting through the air in visible duels, began to report a new sensation, the attack that came with no warning. There was no screaming, there was no shadow, only the impact. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its 2 Allison V1710 turbocharged engines, produced a muffled, deep, almost whispered rumble in the upper layers of the troposphere. Above 7,000 meters, this technical characteristic became a weapon. The turbocharger didn't just preserve power, it masked presence. And in the Pacific Air Theater, where Japanese doctrine still depended on ear and sight, sound was a vital alarm. When that sound disappeared, the chance to react also disappeared. It was a merciless technical irony. While the Japanese bet on lightness, sacrificing armor and communication for maneuverability, the Americans bet on integration. The silence of the P-38 was not an accident. It was a direct result of engineering focused on performance at altitude and prolonged lift. The narrow fuselage, the contra-rotating propellers, the exhausts positioned far from the cockpit, and the sound insulation provided by the turbochargers created an acoustic predator. It was not necessary to see it to be slaughtered, and that, psychologically, was devastating. Accounts from surviving pilots describe times when their colleagues simply exploded in mid-air. No warning, no eye contact, no chance. A flash, a scream on the radio, and nothing more. In addition to the muffled sound, there was the issue of attack geometry. The nose-focused armament, 4 Browning 50 machine guns and a 20mm and Hispano cannon, eliminated the chronic problem of single-engine fighters, convergence of fire. On the Zero, as on most fighters of its generation, the guns were on the wings. This forced pilots to calculate the exact distance at which their shots would converge. It was a delicate margin. A few seconds wrong, and the projectiles passed the target without touching it. The Lightning, by contrast, fired like a precision spear. Everything came from the same point in a straight line. It was not necessary to turn to hit. It was enough to point it out. The combination of vertical attack, silence, and unified armament turned the P-38 into an air ambush machine. A weapon that didn't fight, executed. From the Japanese point of view, this change was incomprehensible. The air warfare they had learned in aviation schools was based on observation, approach, and engagement. The fighting lasted minutes, with multiple turns and flanking attempts. Now, everything happened in seconds. A dive, one shot, a vertical escape. War became mathematical, no longer a duel. And most Japanese pilots didn't even have the tactical vocabulary to understand what hit them. In the report from the 204th Imperial Air Wing, a commander wrote, "They come from above, shoot in a straight line, and disappear. We have no answer to that." The impact of this tactic was also felt on Japanese radar posts and commando units. Lightning came and went so quickly that early warning radars, already technologically inferior, were useless. Operators had difficulty tracking objects flying high with a reduced thermal profile and crossing the field of view at very high speeds. By the time an alert was issued, it was too late. An American pilot years later accurately described the feeling of the attack. "We would go down like an arrow, shoot for less than 2 seconds, and pull back. When they saw us, they were already dead." What began as a technical advantage soon turned into doctrine. P-38 squadrons began to deliberately exploit noiselessness and vertical surprise as an operational principle. They hunted patrols, intercepted bombers, destroyed planes on takeoff. Japanese bases on the islands began to report unexplained losses. Fighter jets disappeared before they could respond to the attack. Officers suspected sabotage. But it was not sabotage. It was industrial silence. This was the invisible face of modern warfare, and perhaps the most humiliating, because you can't fight against what you don't see, you cannot counterattack what you do not hear, and you can't plan when the enemy turns off the sound of his own presence. In 1944, a Japanese operational directive even listed as a top priority threat any group of twin-engine fighters operating at altitude. The recommendation was clear. Avoid ascent if contacts are detected above 20,000 feet. The exact model is unknown, probably P-38. The war was now a game of heights, speeds, and silence. And while Japan was trying to understand the new rule, the Americans were already working on their next weapon, an aircraft with an even longer range, heavier, taller, capable of carrying tons of bombs and flying beyond the range of any Zero. Lightning will lead the way. What would come now would not hunt planes. He would hunt cities. In December 1943, a document captured by American forces at a Japanese airbase in New Britain caught the attention of the USAAF intelligence sector. Written in an objective tone, without the hyperbole common to imperial propaganda, the report carried a sentence that summarized the ongoing strategic fracture. Avoid combat with the P-38 type, except in case of overwhelming advantage. It was the cold and practical admission that Lightning had overstepped the bounds of Japanese doctrine. That two-engine machine, until recently considered clumsy and slow, had become an unwanted, ubiquitous, and above all, uncontrollable presence. For the first time since the beginning of the war in the Pacific, a Japanese military document recognized not only a tactical inferiority, but a technical impotence. Other reports reinforce this picture. In interrogations conducted with prisoners of war, Japanese pilots reported a behavioral change between squadrons. Before, the approach of American aircraft was received with adrenaline and offensive spirit. Now it was preceded by tension, silence, and an almost automatic gesture, looking up. Lightning was not on the horizon, it fell from the sky. And this, in a war based on visual initiative and instant reaction, broke the chain of command in seconds. A veteran pilot of the Imperial Navy, shot down and rescued in mid-1944, confessed, "We were taught to turn, to flank, to use the sky as a sword. But the P-38 cut through the sky before we could raise the blade." The testimonies piled up with unsettling patterns. The recognition of constant surprise, the confusion generated by vertical speed, the difficulty in locating the enemy before being hit, and above all, the recurring feeling of perceived invulnerability. Many pilots reported that the P-38 seemed to suffer no damage, even under direct fire. Some of this was explainable: reinforced armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, electrical and hydraulic redundancy. Lightning is designed to withstand impact, return, and be repaired on the ground. JAO 0. I couldn't stand a single mistake. It was light because it needed to be agile. But this lightness took its toll on fragility. In actual combat, there was no margin for failure, and the P-38 explored every bank. In a preserved letter from a Japanese lieutenant of the 202nd Air Group, dated February 1944, the description was melancholy. "We see our brothers rise into combat and disappear into the sky. The radio remains muted. Silence is the new sound of death." The feeling of moral disorientation was evident. These men, trained within a system that glorified dueling, were now facing a weapon that negated dueling itself. The P-38 did not fight with honor. He fought with logic. It attacked without warning, fired accurately, and disappeared before the reaction. The doctrine of Bushido, applied to the skies, was useless against an aerodynamic equation. Further on, a compilation of Imperial Air Force field records revealed a shocking statistic. Between 1943 and the first quarter of 1944, more than 62% of Japanese fighter losses attributed to fighting with American fighters in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea were caused by P-38s. This number by itself would be enough to raise the alarm. But the most telling data was qualitative. In more than half of these engagements, the Japanese pilots could not even open fire before being shot down. The enemy simply saw them first. He shot first. He killed first. And for a system that based its doctrine on the capacity of the warrior, this asymmetry was unbearable. In post-war interviews conducted by Japanese and American scholars, the narrative repeated itself with resignation. Many of the survivors did not hide their technical admiration for the Lightning. A former officer of the 582nd Air Regiment in 1961 stated, "The P-38 was like a shadow with teeth. You didn't see him, but when you realized it, he was already bleeding." And he added, "It was not an airplane. It was a system, an armed wing of the industry." This phrase, apparently banal, is central, because what the Japanese were facing was not just a new fighter. It was the visible apex of an invisible chain: factories, engineering, doctrine, infrastructure, logistics, intelligence. Lightning was just the tip of the spear, the visible arm of a much larger war machine. And the psychological impact of this was irreversible. Entire bases began to alter patrol routes solely based on the possibility that P-38s were in the area. Commanders demanded lower altitudes, night flights, tortuous routes. It wasn't just tactical evasion, it was institutionalized fear. And an air force that flies in fear flies defeated. In 1944, as the war was nearing its climax, Japanese reports themselves indicated that losses to P-38 fighters were not diminishing, even with fewer Lightning in the theater. Reputation had become a weapon, fear multiplier. But the most symbolic came with the change in behavior of the Japanese aces themselves. Men like Saburo Sakai and Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, among the biggest names in imperial aviation, began to fly with a more closed formation, avoiding individual actions. It was the final sign that the duel was over. Air warfare was no longer art, it became calculus, and the world was beginning to understand that this logic, cold, coordinated, invisible, was not exclusive to the Pacific. Because, at the same time, on the other side of the world, a new type of German pilot was beginning to report something similar, about a new machine, coming from the same arsenal, raised under the same doctrine, and also carrying the same signature, American engineering. While the Japanese Empire saw its greatest aces fall one by one, victims of a war that consumed not only planes, but irreplaceable talents, the United States operated in the opposite direction. The American war machine, contrary to what the enemies expected, did not just produce aircraft. It produced continuity. Each experienced pilot who returned home became an instructor. Each successful mission became doctrine. And each new talent was polished within a system that mixed repetition, science, and standardization. In this environment, the greatest American aces in the Pacific emerged, and the plane that consecrated them was not the Mustang nor the Thunderbolt. It was the Lightning. Richard Bong, a native of Wisconsin, was one of those men, quiet, methodical, and relentlessly effective. Aboard his P-38 named Marge, he shot down 40 enemy aircraft, becoming the greatest ace in the history of American aviation. His secret was not instinct, it was discipline. Bong knew the limits of altitude, the ideal diving speed, the accurate firing point of the 50s concentrated on the nose. He studied his opponent before facing him, and it used the P-38 as a mathematical execution platform. The same was true of Thomas Maguire, who racked up 38 confirmed victories before falling on a mission. These men were not impulsive heroes. They were lethal operators of a system that turned statistics into victories. The secret of this supremacy lay in two pillars: standardization and autonomy. The P-38 gave the pilot everything he needed: power, range, visibility, redundancy. But it did not dictate the combat. He allowed the pilot to decide. American aces weren't just well-trained, they were allowed to think. This tactical autonomy, rare among combatants at the time, allowed for rapid adaptations, new maneuvers, and changes in approach. While Japanese pilots followed strict instructions based on pre-modern warfare principles, Americans wrote new manuals in mid-flight. The doctrine was not imposed from the top down. It was refined by practice and immediately relayed to schools. It is at this point that the contrast becomes brutal. In 1944, the average flight hours of an American pilot before being sent into combat was 500. The Japanese, suffocated by losses and lack of resources, were dispatching recruits with less than 100 hours. An American ace entered combat, having already simulated different scenarios. A Japanese rookie entered the cockpit, not knowing how to react to an attack from above, without ever having faced a 50 blast, with no experience against turbochargers. The technical superiority of the P-38, added to the well-trained human factor, created an insurmountable gap. And this gap wasn't just noticeable, it was measurable. On missions over the Philippines and the Mariana Islands, squadrons equipped with Lightning often returned with 4, 5, or 6 wins without any losses. The arithmetic was consistent. A well-trained American P-38 squadron could shoot down 3 times as many aircraft as it lost. The survival rate was also higher. Pilots who were hit, even with severe damage, were able to return thanks to the robustness of the twin-engine structure, self-sealing tanks, and redundant control systems. And here's the data that the Germans, and the world, ignored. By 1944, the United States was graduating 93,000 new pilots a year. Of those, thousands would fly heavy fighters like the P-38 with full training, simulator, instrument flight practice, and mastery of long-distance air navigation. For comparison, the Luftwaffe trained fewer than 15,000 pilots in the entire same year. The difference was not just logistical, it was civilizational. If this number surprises you, comment there, absolute power. Because the Americans weren't just preparing soldiers, they were cultivating operators of an industrial doctrine. To the Japanese, who valued courage and almost spiritual instinct, this form of warfare was disconcerting. In post-war interrogations, many officers reported feeling cold in combat with American aces. A captain in the Imperial Navy described, "They didn't pursue, they predicted. They attacked where we were going to be, not where we were. It was like fighting a shadow with a compass." This realization reveals the profound change in the character of air warfare. Intuition, so valued at the beginning of the conflict, was being replaced by statistical anticipation. Bravery still had its value, but it was ineffective without the backing of science. The impact of this echoed not only in the skies, but in the military structure. With each successful mission of aces like Bong and Maguire, troop morale increased, and Japanese reports became bleaker. The P-38 was no longer just a feared aircraft. He became a symbol, the visible face of American technical superiority. And when these pilots crashed, like Maguire in early 1945, the impact was profound but not paralyzing, because the system didn't depend on heroes. He produced substitutes. Each ace, he left a documented legacy, an updated manual, and dozens of apprentices ready. That was the difference. Japan worshipped its aces as gods. The United States documented them as processes. And in a long-term war, the winner would be not the one with the best myths, but the one with the best method. But as the Pacific revealed this new order, Europe was about to feel the same storm. Lightning was not exclusive to that theater. Soon her range and accuracy would allow for a new role, escorting bombers into the heart of the Reich. And once again, the enemies who laughed at his appearance discovered too late that they had underestimated the sound of thunder. In April 1944, a new tactical bulletin was circulated among the squadrons of Japanese naval aviation based at Palau and Truk. Signed by the Air Fleet General Staff, the document recommended in clear words that pilots avoid direct confrontation with P-38 Lightning fighters. The recommendation was not conditional, it was strategic. For the first time, the Japanese command ordered its men not to engage the enemy, to avoid him. To the young men trained under the unwavering ethic of Bushido, that order did not seem just an operational adjustment. It was a spiritual rupture. The doctrine that had formed generations of aviators, which preached that life only found meaning in honorable sacrifice in combat, now demanded that one survive, running. The moral impact was devastating. In the following weeks, officers reported an increase in nervous breakdowns, coordination failures, and episodes of passive disobedience. Experienced pilots were hesitant to engage. Newcomers were relieved to abort missions. The Lightning had won more than duels. He had conquered the myth, not with speeches, but with repetition. With each new attack from above, with each Zero shot down before it could even spin, the samurai doctrine bled, and there was no longer any way to hide it. The escape orders were accompanied by new flight guidelines, lower altitudes, shorter patrols, use of cloud cover, and abandonment of rigid formations. Each line of the manual was an admission. Japan no longer dominated the skies. He just tried to survive in them. In the preserved charts of pilots of the 261st Kokutai, based on Saipan, the anguish was palpable. A lieutenant wrote to his brother, "We have been trained to attack. They indoctrinated us to die. Now we are asked to fly like rats, hidden, running. What is a warrior who cannot war?" These words sum up the psychological breakdown that has befallen the squads. Lightning didn't just destroy aircraft. He disfigured identity, and in doing so it also corroded the command fabric. Captains who had previously required bravery now recommended prudence. Heroism had become a logistical risk, pride an operational threat. The contrast with the beginning of the war was brutal. In 1941, the elite of Japanese aviation was made up of men who saw the sky as an extension of the mat. Flying was meditation, combat, ritual, to die, liberation. In 1944, the same skies were occupied by metallic shadows coming from across the ocean, dark not out of malice, but out of method. The P-38 did not fly with emotion. He flew with calculation. He did not pursue glory. He chased coordinates. It was precise, silent, deadly. And when it did appear the only logical answer, it was to retreat. The unthinkable had become doctrine. In the southern Philippines, a commander of the 343rd Kokutai tried to rescue the offensive spirit with fiery speeches. He gathered the pilots, evoked the honor of the homeland, and ordered them to attack a squadron of P-38s sighted to the west. Of the 11 Zeros that took off, only 3 returned. None even managed to get close to the enemy before being shot. The captain, under pressure, was transferred to Tokyo. His attempt to restore the old order had been stifled by the new reality. You don't fight wind with swords. This inversion of values began to generate a more profound effect than the simple statistics of losses. Japan began to face a military identity crisis. If combat was no longer desirable and death was no longer necessary, what was left? The accounts of surviving pilots point to a rare phenomenon: relief from defeat. Many said they were grateful to escape, and some even confessed that the escape order had freed them from a certain and useless death. It was the beginning of ideological defection. Men did not physically desert, but they deserted internally. They began to question the meaning. The doctrine did not break with shouts. She was crumbling in silence. Meanwhile, the Americans further improved the efficiency of the P-38. New models with larger tanks, improved sighting, and more reliable engines made the Lightning an even more constant presence. He was no longer just an interceptor. It was escort, scout, reconnaissance platform, bomber hunter, and executor of strategic targets. Each function was performed with the same coldness. And each new encounter left the same impression on the Japanese pilots. They were not facing combatants. They were facing a gear. This moral collapse has reached the point of altering the behavior of even the most fanatics. On Okinawa in late 1944, a group of young kamikazes were prevented from taking off after an alert of the presence of P-38s in the region. The officer in charge feared that they would be shot down before reaching the target. Yes, even strategic suicide has been postponed by tactical fear. It was the last piece of the puzzle. When even dying became risky, it was a sign that the enemy had not only won on the battlefield, but in the mind. And while Japanese doctrine collapsed under the weight of technical reality, Germany began to witness the same process. Because the Lightning, which had already crushed Eastern pride, now crossed the Atlantic with a new function. Escort bombers to the heart of the Reich. And Luftwaffe pilots, once arrogant in the face of the American twin-engine novelty, were about to find out that the sound of defeat could also come double. In 1944, while the skies of the Pacific were burning with the constant presence of the P-38 Lightning, Japan was desperately trying to respond to the American advance with what was left of industrial capacity. But the truth could no longer be covered up by patriotic speeches. Japanese production was at a standstill inside. The shortage of aluminum forced the reuse of damaged airframes. Special steel inventories had been compromised since the loss of Indochina. And with each new month, aircraft factories struggled not to innovate, but simply to survive. While Lockheed delivered new batches of Lightning with minor aerodynamic upgrades and more reliable electrical systems, Japan still sent old versions of the Zero to the front, with improvised adjustments, fragile fuel tanks, and poorly calibrated armaments. It was like facing a Swiss watch with a rusty dagger. The Japanese response to the threat posed by Lightning should have been the development of a new generation of twin-engine fighters. But the Kawasaki Ki-102, the most promising among them, arrived when the war was already decided. Its first operational unit took off only in 1945. Of the 238 aircraft produced, few saw effective combat. Most were stranded on land, with no spare parts, no trained pilots, no fuel. The rigidity of Japanese industry, still based on artisanal workshops, lack of standardization, and dependence on blocked sea routes, prevented any agile response. While the United States operated under a logic of integrated assembly lines and scale production, Japan assembled fighters on islands with basic tools under constant bombardments. The operational availability statistics were even more brutal. At the height of the Pacific Campaign, the Americans kept 82% of their P-38s in flying condition, even operating on improvised runways with hostile weather and tense logistics. This was possible because of Lightning's engineering philosophy. Modular parts, interchangeable motors, standardized maintenance, and clear manuals. The Japanese, in the middle of 1944, struggled to keep just over 45% of their aircraft operational. The rest was on the ground, waiting for parts, waiting for pilots, waiting for decisions that never came. Air warfare was no longer decided in combat. It was decided in the workshops, and in these workshops, Japan had already lost. The contrast was visible even in the details. The P-38s received field upgrades, new radios, gyro sights, anti-reflective paint, new camouflage schemes, even at forward bases. Meanwhile, many Zeros were thrown into combat with chronic problems of overheating, electrical failures, and misaligned armaments. There were reports of pilots taking off with machine guns that failed after the first shot. Others with unbalanced propellers due to lack of adequate replacement. What was once a feared air force was now a spectre, a set of metallic casings held at will. But will does not fuel. Will does not lubricate gears. Will does not replace landing gear. This deterioration was not only material, it was symbolic. Field officers began to write reports with unprecedented terms: structural impossibility of reaction, logistical infeasibility for tactical adjustments, discontinuity of the replacement line. Translated, this meant that the war could no longer be won. It could only be delayed. A Japanese colonel, in a letter captured on the outskirts of Iwo Jima, described the situation with bitter accuracy. "We face enemies that are manufactured with greater speed than we can bury our own." The phrase became a symbol of an undeniable reality. The war of engineers had crushed the war of warriors. Meanwhile, the United States continued to expand its capabilities. In 1944, Lockheed produced 3,923 P-38s in a single year. It was more than all of Japan's combined fighter production in the same period. The American factories operated 24 hours a day, with shift rotation, standardization of components, and continuous quality testing. Lightnings rolled off the production line with defect rates close to zero. Field maintenance teams received customized toolkits, specific training, and logistical support by air and sea. Even the packaging of parts was standardized, reducing errors and speeding up repairs. Logistical efficiency went so far as to predict failures before they occurred. Engines were replaced preventively. Hydraulic systems were tested with ground simulations. Each new P-38 was an evolution, each mission a lesson, and each adjustment a step forward. Japan, stuck in its decentralized structure without the ability to adapt quickly, watched defeat become inevitable. The Ki-84 Hayate, another promising fighter, performed promisingly in combat, but was delivered with faulty tires, unstable engines, and poor reliability. It was yet another heroic effort shipwrecked in a sea of impossibilities. It was not a war of bravery, it was a war of method, and on that field the Americans were playing at home. What the Japanese didn't understand, or understood too late, is that the Lightning wasn't an isolated fighter. It was the visible node of an invisible web, made up of mass production, intercontinental transportation, predictive engineering, and doctrine based on continuous feedback. It represented not just an air threat, but an entire philosophy of total war. And it was this philosophy that began to cross the oceans towards Europe. The P-38s, initially designed for the Pacific, were now seen in the skies over the Reich, in bomber escort, in deep reconnaissance missions, in precision strikes. The Luftwaffe, which had previously mocked the unusual silhouette of that twin-engine American, was about to feel firsthand what its Eastern allies had already learned. They don't laugh at a machine that doesn't make mistakes, because when she arrives, she has already decided what will happen. And no one, not even Hitler's aces, were prepared to face the sound of thunder coming from the west. By the end of 1943, something silent but decisive had already changed in the way the United States conceived of air warfare. While Japan was still training pilots for corner combat, the traditional dance of closed maneuvers where agility and instinct decided victory, the Americans had moved to another tactical dimension. On the ground, the manuals have changed. In the air, the formations changed. In the mind, the entire concept of combat was rewritten. The P-38 Lightning was not just a technological vector, he was the catalyst for a new doctrine, war as engineering. Instead of seeking combat, Lightning defined it. Instead of reacting, he anticipated. And this difference, almost invisible to Japanese eyes, would become fatal. The key was energy. The concept of maneuver kill has been replaced by energy advantage. American pilots began training not to spin faster, but to reach higher, maintain more speed, and dive with surgical precision. The P-38, with its two supercharged engines, sustained these maneuvers at altitudes where the Zeros were beginning to lose control and vision. And when the Lightning attacked from above, there was no maneuver possible. It was a blast of autocannon coming from the nose. No need for convergence, no warning, no margin for response. This doctrine was built on layers. First the flight in pairs, then the use of mixed formations, such as the famous finger four, which allowed cross-coverage and simultaneous maneuvers. Each pilot covered the other, each attack was protected, and above all, there was the radio. While Japanese pilots still communicated with gestures or smoke signals limited by fragile radios and unstable channels, the Americans coordinated ambushes, warnings, and counterattacks with millimeter precision. In combat above Bougainville, 4 P-38s intercepted a formation of Betty bombers escorted by Zero fighters. Thanks to radio communication, they split into two pairs, isolated the fighters, and destroyed the bombers without losing any units. The fight lasted 6 minutes. It was the practical demonstration of a new doctrine, mathematically orchestrated, industrially supported. Japan, stuck with the idea of the pilot as an autonomous warrior, found itself overcome by a structure that transformed each man into a network node. The Americans no longer trained heroes. They trained operators of a system that started in flight simulators, went through clear doctrines, and ended in collective maneuvers in the air. War is no longer a duel. It became an algorithm. And in this algorithm, P-38 was just one of the variables, powerful but subordinate to a larger equation. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. But doctrines are harder to change than engines. If you're enjoying unraveling these hidden facts and technical comparisons that rewrite the narrative of war, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can continue to bring you these stories that show that victory often starts with a spreadsheet and ends with silence in the heavens. Back to the doctrine. Americans also began to use the concept of negative missions. That is, flights that did not seek combat, but forced the enemy to make a mistake, causing climb, fuel consumption, loss of position. It was psychological warfare for exhaustion. And the P-38, with its extended range and robustness, was the ideal platform. In a captured account of a Japanese pilot based in Rabaul, he describes, "They came, circled above us, without attacking. They just watched. When we decided to go up, they would dive in and choose who to destroy." This type of report was repeated. The Japanese feeling was that they were no longer in control, that combat was always imposed, never chosen. On Okinawa, the P-38 was used even to guide less experienced squadrons, functioning as an air navigator, advanced sensor, and command platform. The American war doctrine became modular, each plane with a function, each flight with multiple purposes. The Zeros, trapped in the logic of the duel, became predictable, and predictability in war is a sentence. The statistic bears it out. In the first 2 months of 1944, P-38 units in the Pacific reported 376 encounters with Japanese fighters. In 312 of them, the Americans attacked first. This constant anticipation was not luck. It was applied science. American manuals began to include energy diagrams, rate of climb tables, dive profiles, radar shadow zones. An American pilot did not fly with instinct. It flew with data, and this shocked the Japanese. For them, combat was art, instinct, improvisation, will. For Americans, it was engineering, planning, execution, review. The philosophical difference became a practical difference, and this difference, fueled by an industrial machine that produced more, trained better, and corrected faster, was what won the war before it was even over. Japan would still try to respond. It would develop new versions of Zero, new doctrines based on defensive formations, and even experimental fighters. But the gap was too deep. You don't learn vector calculus in the middle of diving. And when war is defined by who gets there first, who shoots first, and who disappears first, there is no perfect curve that can reverse fate. And in this new scenario, not even the Luftwaffe, with its decorated aces, would escape the equation, because the P-38 had already crossed the Atlantic. And in the next part, we'll see how the same plane that humiliated the samurai, now he did the same with the hunters of the Reich. In January 1945, in the still warm skies of the Philippines, a Japanese squadron of Zero fighters took off to intercept an American bomber formation. Among the young pilots, there was one with only 86 hours of flight time and no combat experience. He was flying a fighter that 7 years earlier had been feared and revered. But now, Zero was just a specter of the past. Its lightweight frame, its fragile weaponry, its lack of armor, everything that once made it agile, now made it vulnerable. Above him, invisible against the sun, flew the Predators. 4 P-38, lightning on escort patrol. They were not there to duel, they were there to clear the sky. On the first turn, the American squadron's radio recorded, "Eye contact, altitude 12 mil, no threat." This was the standard phrase when the enemy was identified as unable to react. The attack came seconds later. The P-38s dived in formation, firing in short, direct bursts. 2 Zeros exploded before they could even spin. The third tried to climb, but lost power and was hit in the fuel tank. Only one managed to escape, for not having been seen. That was the new standard. From 1945 onwards, the encounters between Zeros and Lightnings ceased to be confrontations and became technical executions. The difference was no longer just one of performance. It was one of time, doctrine, generation. Japan, consumed by shortages, began to send aircraft with recycled parts, worn engines and improvised armaments into the air. Meanwhile, the Americans, supplied by an assembly line that delivered a new P-38 every 37 minutes, arrived with 0-kilometer aircraft overhauled, refueled and operated by rotated crews, rested and informed. The Japanese flew by faith, the Americans by protocol. In Okinawa, in the last quarter of the war, the P-38 kill ratio reached 12-1. In some cases, the Zeros didn't even open fire. They were hit before that. Behind the scenes, the Japanese commanders knew. In internal reports of the Naval Air Force, the Zeros came to be classified as deterrent aircraft, an ambiguous expression to mask reality. They were decoys. Their mission was to distract, delay, give time to heavy bombers or ships. The myth of the flying samurai had been buried by arithmetic, and this math had names. 4, 50 machine guns, 1 Hispano cannon, 720 km H in diving, service ceiling of 13,000 meters, and operational autonomy of 2,200 kilometers with external tanks. The Lightning was no longer just a fighter, it was an aerial annihilation system, a hunting platform in 3 dimensions. The coldness of the American doctrine was also reflected in the logic of the fighting. There was no more glory in heaven. There was efficiency. Missions were planned so that the enemy would never complete the formation. They flew with an altimetric advantage, with sun at their backs, with evacuation plans and rescue corridors. Japanese pilots, on the other hand, were instructed to take off and meet the enemy visually. No radar, no secure communication, no tactical support. The technical superiority of the USA had become absolute. It was as if one side fought with rulers and maps, and the other with spears. By April 1945, official data from the 5th Air Command revealed that 82% of Japanese fighter shootdowns in the Philippines had been carried out without the enemy opening fire. This is the ruin statistic, and if it surprises you, write in the comments. Shocking data, because behind that number were young people who had never received real combat instruction, just maps, a uniform, and a mission with no return. Still, Japan continued to send its last aviators. Some had barely completed their training. They were 17-year-old teenagers with fear in their eyes and wooden swords in the dormitories. It was no longer a question of strategy, it was desperation. And the P-38, a symbol of American systemic superiority, was the last executioner of these sacrificial flights, a cold, precise, ruthless machine which fulfilled its function without hesitation and without error. The Pacific sky was getting quieter and quieter, not for lack of fighting, but for lack of resistance. In many regions, the Lightning flew unopposed. They carried out reconnaissance, cover, and ground attack missions, but always with eyes on high, because even when the enemy seemed defeated, American doctrine taught, superiority must be maintained. And so, day after day, the P-38 consolidated its presence as the end of zero. Not just the plane, but the ideal. In June 1945, a report from the American Joint Chiefs of Staff blunt, the combat capability of the Zero model no longer poses a strategic threat. It was the death certificate of a legend. It was not signed with ink. It was engraved on aluminum, lead, and fire. And on the other side of the world, another enemy watched these reports. I studied the data. I observed the pattern. The Luftwaffe, which had once dominated the skies over Europe, would now face the same fighter. And he would understand, too late, that the American machine that had destroyed the samurai. I was already flying over Berlin. In a letter dated March 3, 1945, written on thin paper and stained by the salt of the island climate, a young Japanese pilot, only 19 years old, leaves a simple farewell. "Mother, tomorrow I face the double-tailed demons. I don't expect to come back, but I'll fight with what I can." It was his first real mission, and also the last. The nickname the Japanese gave the P-38, Ni no O, meant just that, the two-tailed demon, not because of the strange appearance, but because of the way it appeared out of nowhere and took everything. Lightning didn't just rule the skies. He occupied the thoughts, the nightmares, the last breaths before takeoff. It was the shadow that the manuals did not explain, the statistic that the instructors did not know how to dispute. And above all, it was the silent omen of the approaching defeat. Among the fragments recovered after the war, dozens of letters like this reveal a painful pattern. The pilots knew they were headed for unequal combat. One of them writes, "I trained for 2 months. I flew 7 times. I haven't shot yet. My instructor crashed last week. Tomorrow it's me." Another, "When we see the sky too clear, we know that the American fighter jets are there, invisible." The reports do not bring anger. There is no hatred, just resignation and a kind of silent fear, which carries more lucidity than fanaticism. War, for these young people, was no longer an ideology. It was a sentence. This human dimension contrasts brutally with the industrial logic of the enemy. While the Japanese wrote farewell letters, the Americans wrote tactics manuals. While the Zeros were repaired on the basis of duct tape and hope, the P-38s received daily maintenance, new parts, full tanks, and pilots trained in simulators. The Japanese airmen were facing an aluminum wall with wooden arches, and they knew. "The sound of thunder comes later. Theirs come first," said a pilot who survived 2 encounters and was sidelined by injuries. It wasn't a fight, it was a hunt. This brutal asymmetry broke not only Japan's wings, but also its doctrinal soul. The Bushido Code, which inspired courage, now created an unbearable burden. Running away was shame, but fighting was suicide. In one of the diaries found at an abandoned base in Mindanao, the airman writes, "I saw 3 of our own evaporate without understanding what hit them. The earth was silent. Heaven even more so. It was emptiness, an emptiness where there was once pride." The technical irony of this tragedy is clear. The same Japan that built Zero with artisanal obsession, sacrificing protection to gain lightness, now paid the price of that decision in lives that were impossible to replace. A Zero hit by a concentrated burst from a P-38 had no chance of correction nor of forced landing. It broke, set fire, disappeared. And on the other side, the P-38s returned with bullet holes, crooked wings, but alive. They survived to get back to the hangar, be repaired, and fly the next day. Japan was losing planes and men. The United States was losing fuel. In American instruction centers, a pilot who made a mistake returned to the simulator. In Japan, he died. And this statistic multiplied as the months went by. By June 1945, more than 70% of new Japanese aviators did not complete 3 missions. Each of them was replaced by another young man, just as unprepared. The cycle was cruel, silent, predictable, and the letters, the only witnesses to the anguish, became documents of a generation that was sacrificed not by the war itself, but by the refusal to accept that it had changed. The technical war had won. Engineering defeated instinct. Logistics silenced heroism. And at the center of this transformation flew the P-38, not as a symbol of arrogance, but as a direct result of a culture that chose to prepare minds, machines, and maps. Who understood that war is not solitary courage, it is a system, it's mathematics, it's repetition, and who ignored it? He wrote farewell letters. But that story isn't over yet. Because while the young Japanese fell without a chance, the eyes of the Luftwaffe watched, with arrogance and disbelief, the reports from the Pacific. They believed that the P-38 was effective only against inferior enemies, and therefore they would make the same mistake. In the next part, we'll look at what happened when lightning crossed the ocean and was tested against Germany's best riders, and what happened left Berlin in silence. The silence that remained after the P-38's last mission in the Pacific was not just the absence of engines, it was the overwhelming presence of a lesson. Japan, which had started the war with technical elegance and doctrinal confidence, ended up kneeling before a cold, efficient, meticulously planned machine. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was not just a combat aircraft. He was the turning point between two eras. On the one hand, the individual combat, almost poetic. On the other, war as an exact science, conducted by engineers, sustained by factories, and won by logistics chains. Japan bet on tradition, honor, and improvisation. The United States in simulation, standardization, and volume. One country trained pilots as warriors. The other produced them as technicians. In the end, it wasn't the fastest who won. It was the most predictable, the most repairable, the most replicable. The impact was so profound that it reverberated in the following decades. Post-war Japan, rebuilt under the rubble of that defeat, did not return to training samurai from the air. It has returned to producing technology. He adopted engineering as his national religion. And ironically, that country that in 1942 did not understand how the Lightning turbocharger worked, became in the 60s and 70s the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution in precision, electronics, and automation. One of Imperial Japan's most respected pilots, Saburo Sakai, who survived more than 200 missions, would declare years later, "The P-38 destroyed our soul, but it made us see the future." And it was the belated recognition that modern warfare does not forgive beauty or bravery. It rewards systems. This transition between the War of the Knights and the War of the Engineers also reveals a moral mirror. Japanese bravery was not defeated by American cowardice. It was won by method. Honor was not subjugated by quantity, but by logic. And this is perhaps the most profound lesson. Courage without logistical support becomes noise. Loyalty without industry becomes martyrdom. Japan launched her children into the sky with wings made of faith. The United States launched them with checklists, radios, parts reserves, and statistics. Even the nations watching from afar, Germany, Italy, the Soviet Union, understood that something had changed, that it was not enough to train the best pilot or build the most maneuverable fighter. It was necessary to create a system where the victory was repeatable, where one man's mistake did not condemn the mission. The Lightning was just that, not a miracle of flight, but a cog in a larger, impersonal but infallible machine. Each flight of his was an equation solved before takeoff. And this reasoning extended into the future. The modern planes that would fly in the following decades, F-86, F-4 Phantoms, F-15s, would not be designed by knights of the sky, but by mathematicians, programmers, and data analysts. From the P-38 onwards, the skies ceased to be a field of honor to become a chessboard of algorithms, and the first country to understand this won. But before we close this story, one last revelation is missing, because the P-38 didn't just change the war in the Pacific. He crossed oceans. He was tested against Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, and even against the best aces in the Luftwaffe. And there, where German arrogance believed it had seen it all, the American Lightning proved once again that heaven does not forgive tradition, only efficiency. The last zero did not fall in combat. It fell silent. When the P-38 last appeared over the Pacific Islands, there was no more pursuit, no maneuver, no more escape, just recognition. The sky, which had been a temple of Japanese bravery, became the absolute domain of a machine designed to win even before it flies. The collapse was not just military, it was ideological. The code of honor that guided the pilots of the empire was reduced to impotence in the face of an enemy that did not fight for duel, but for mission. It was not just the end of an air doctrine. It was the end of an entire era. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning proved that modern warfare doesn't forgive tradition. It rewards repetition, accuracy, system. Japan didn't just lose to an aluminum plane. It lost to a civilization that turned math into air power, that replaced pride with production at scale. and that understood before anyone else that the next war would be decided on the assembly line, not on the flight deck. The lesson is simple and brutal. Bravery without a logistics chain becomes a sacrifice. Technique without maintenance becomes defeat. Courage without fuel becomes memory. As one Luftwaffe officer summed it up in 1945, upon seeing American trucks occupying Berlin, "We were defeated by production and by those who knew how to deliver it." If you value research and the search for historical truth, leave your like right now and subscribe to the channel. This support allows us to continue revealing the technical, moral, and human backstage behind each fight. Write in the comments what was the most shocking fact you discovered in this video, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. Because history is not only made of names and dates, it is made up of decisions, systems, and consequences. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.